This presentation is about the history and application of critical discourse analysis. To find critical discourse studies, see language as a social practice and consider the context of language use to be crucial. It aims to investigate critically social inequality as it is expressed through language use and is therefore not interested in investigating the linguistic unit per se, but in studying social phenomena which are necessarily complex and require a multidisciplinary and methodological approach. There were two books that influenced how scholars thought about language in society, and they were called Language and Control and Language and Ideology. Both of these books were published in 1979, and both books have authors Robert Hodge and Gunther Kress on them. Additionally, the term critical discourse analysis came from Norman Fairclough's 1989 book called Language and Power. It was after this that the group of scholars emerged for critical discourse analysis. And they emerged after a symposium in Amsterdam in January 1991. It was this symposium that gave scholars the opportunity to convene with each other. Because these scholars came from a variety of fields, the manifold roots of CDA lie in a variety of fields. Discourse analysis drew upon post-structural and sociolinguistic theories. And while critical discourse analysis comes from that, the theory really depends upon the researcher. There's no guiding theoretical viewpoint that's consistently used within CDS. However, critical theory is a foundation of CDS, as noted by Wodak and Meyer. Additionally, Rebecca Rogers suggests that critical social theory is a theoretical foundation of CDA, and she writes about CDA in educational research. There are a lot of key players in CDA because it is applied in so many different types of fields. There is a distinction between how Americans and Europeans use CDA. Additionally, there is a distinction between how educational researchers and other disciplines use CDA. There's no specific way that data is collected, and likewise, there's no specific way that scholars approach their analysis. There are a variety of approaches, and no one way is, held better over another. In educational research, which is kind of what I'm going to focus on now, discourse analysis grew out of the work of sociolinguistics, narrative research, linguistic anthropology, and ethnography of communication. Rebecca Rogers indicates that critical approaches of three scholars are the most used by educational researchers, and those scholars are James Paul Gee, Norman Fairclough, and Gunther Kress. I'm going to focus in on James Paul Gee's approach to discourse analysis, which is applied for critical discourse analysis in the chapters that I read. So he uses CDA in educational research, although he would tell you that he doesn't. He's not a critical discourse analysis. He draws upon three different traditions and uses his tools of inquiry as well as his 7 building tests to analyze different texts. In terms of his 7 building tasks, they're practices that are designed for analysts to discover what's being done with language. They include significance, activities, identities, relationships, politics, and the distribution of goods. And here, social goods is referring to anything a social group or society takes as good worth having. Connections is the next building task, and then sign systems and knowledge. And they're tools that allow a researcher to ask questions of their data in a critical way. In addition to these 7 building tasks, Gee draws upon 4 theoretical tools to understand how language is being used. He uses discourse, which he defines as how people use language within different social groups and situations. Additionally, he talks about situated meanings, which refer to how language means different things in different contexts, which is also a part of discourse. He talks about figured worlds, which are typical or normal in certain situations, and also makes them a part of discourses. And finally, he talks about social languages, which refer to the variety of languages people speak, and these are also a part of discourses. The interaction of these 4 theoretical tools are what, in his opinion, make discourse analysis inherently critical. And these are also tools that allow a researcher to ask questions of their data set. Sometimes they have been used in conjunction with the 7 building tasks to create a matrix of a variety of questions that would be asked of the data set. Sometimes people will just use the theoretical tools of inquiry, and sometimes people will just use those 7 building tasks that we previously talked about. It depends on the researcher, and G has noted that he really developed these as tools, mostly for American researchers, and has noted how, other researchers, European and Australian, have criticized him for making his approach to discourse analysis so easy for people to use. And he essentially, maybe not so easy, but he breaks it down a little too much for people. But I know that is what American educational researchers appreciate about him, and it's part of the reason that he is one of the 3 scholars that helped frame the Introduction to Critical Discourse Analysis in Education book. So my annotated bibliography on critical discourse analysis included 3 methodological readings and 2 that applied a method of critical discourse analysis. The Wodak and Meyer article provided an overview of the broad spectrum of CDA, or Critical Discourse Studies, CDS as they call it. After reading this chapter, I read Rogers because it narrowed in on CDA methodology and educational research. Rogers described 3 approaches commonly taken up by educational researchers using CDA. And one of them was James Paul G's approach. And the 2 application articles that I read used G's approach in their studies, which is how I narrowed in on those. There are a lot of different approaches to CDA, and I gravitate towards G's methods of discourse analysis because the 7 building tasks lend themselves to his tools of inquiry, which, as he puts it, are inherently critical. It was interesting to read some additional writings about critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies. All 3 of the scholars that were mentioned in Rogers' chapter all claim that they are not critical discourse analysis. So it was kind of interesting to see, their reasoning behind these and why they don't necessarily believe that they are, critical discourse analysis scholars. But, in looking at all of their approaches, I can see exactly why Rogers put them in there and why they're categorized as critical discourse analysis scholars. It is interesting because, as I noted in the presentation, educational researchers versus researchers from other fields have, differences in opinion of what critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies are, what approaches are valid, and that's also even different between, American, European, and Australian critical discourse analysis scholars. And a teacher is being interviewed. Anytime you see I, it's the interviewer, or sorry, I in brackets is the interviewer commenting back to the interviewee. So after being asked if she ever discusses social issues in her classroom, issues to do with power, race, or class, the teacher says, I talk about housing. We talk about a lot of the low income things. I said, hey, wait a minute. I said, do you think the city is going to take care of an area that you don't take care of yourself? And the researcher says, uh-huh. I said, how many of you have been up blank street? They raise their hands. I say, how about blank avenue? That's where those gigantic houses are. I said, how many pieces of furniture are sitting in the front yard? The interviewer responds, well, none. I said, how much trash is lying around? None. I said, how many houses are spray painted? How many of them have kicked in, have broke down cars? So in looking at this example interview data from G, the first thing to do is start looking at the significance building task. So in terms of doing that, you might ask yourself how the language is being used to make certain things significant. And in this scenario, the teacher is making neighborhood conditions very significant and draws a distinction between the rich and the poor people. While she doesn't specifically say that, the different examples that she goes through, or the examples that she goes through about the houses and how different they are, makes that very significant. The next thing that you're going to look, you might turn to is the activities building tasks. So in terms of the activities task, you might ask, how is the language being used to carry out actions? So in this situation, the teacher is having this discussion with her classroom, or the students in her classroom, and the conversation that she's having is enacting an activity of a certain form of advice giving. So, while she's not necessarily giving them specific advice on what to do, she's talking about, what makes certain neighborhoods successful and what doesn't. So she's carrying out actions in that way. In terms of the identity building task, you might ask, how is the language being used to build an identity? And through the conversation that she's having with her students, the teacher is creating language that has an identity for her kids. So, people that are associated with low income things that are contrasted to people in richer or, more affluent neighborhoods. So she, holds a view that, you don't necessarily, or she's showing the view and the identity that you don't want to be associated with, the neighborhoods that have their broken down cars or furniture in the yard or houses that are spray painted. The next building task is the relationships building task. So in this task, this building task, you might ask, how is the language being used to build and sustain relationships? So in the conversation that she's having with her students here, she's setting up a relationship with her students where she is the advice giver, and she makes it pretty clear that poor children can't get proper nurturing from parents because they can't even take care of their house. They can't do this or that. And so the teacher is the one who is the advice giver. It's the one that the students need to be going to because they have this, identity that is linked to this relationship. The next one is the politics building task. And so the question you might ask is, how is the language being used to build and destroy social goods? So in a way, the teacher here is blaming the victim, so blaming the low-income families for having these low-income things, as opposed to the more wealthy families with the really big houses. And the language that she's using here is, in terms of poverty and wealth, is really drawing that distinction and saying that people from low-income places are just victims of large social forces over which they have no control, and it's not necessarily motivating for people. The last one is the connections building task, and the question that you might ask here is, how is the language being used to connect things in the world? So the teacher here is connecting the low-income things to a neighborhood. So she's describing what a low-income things might look like in terms of a neighborhood. They might have houses with broken down cars. They might have houses that are spray painted. There might be trash laying around, pieces of furniture sitting in the yard. So she's drawing those distinctions and connecting low-income things to neighborhoods. Finally, the last one is the sign systems and knowledge building task. So the question you might ask here is, how is the language being used to build and tear down communication systems and ways of knowing? In this situation, the teacher is privileging one way to know the world. So she's privileging those gigantic houses and the behavior of the people that live in those gigantic houses. They don't have pieces of furniture in their front yard. They don't have trash. Their houses aren't spray painted, and they don't have broken down cars. So she's showing the students here that poverty is not the SES that you want to be in, and you want to be in a place where you are more affluent and have nicer things. One thing to note is G says that this isn't necessarily a full discourse analysis. It's the place to start. In addition to doing this, you'll break down line by line and do a traditional discourse analysis, but by asking these questions, you're being critical of the data and you are looking at critical issues that are important and could emerge from this data. So using this in conjunction with a line-by-line analysis, you'll essentially be doing critical discourse analysis. So in addition to the references that I used in my annotated bibliography, these are some of the other ones that I took a look at in compiling this presentation for you guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks!